The spoon trembled in my teacup as my daughter hissed, "You should be grateful we let you live here." Still, I didn't flinch, just watched the ripples spread like cracks through porcelain. As the sound echoed, sharp and metallic, I felt her words slice deeper than any silence ever could. While that clink filled the room, I remembered, she was 5 when I paid off this house alone. The same house she now claims, without shame, as if love came with a lease. That's when I realized she can evict me from her heart but never from what's mine. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Barb sat at the kitchen table, the edges of her mug pressed against her palms, trying to steady herself. The soft click of the kettle, long turned off, was the only sound in the room besides the occasional shuffle of Kathy moving around the kitchen. It had been happening more and more lately, those offhand comments that chipped away at Barb's sense of control. Kathy's voice broke the silence again. "You know," Kathy said, a casualness in her tone that felt sharper than it should, "we really should have sold this place a long time ago. You should be grateful we let you live here." Barb froze, the words hitting her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the sentiment, it was the assumption. The way Kathy made it sound like the home Barb had built with her own hands after Bill died was nothing more than a burden. David, who was washing dishes at the sink, nodded absently. "Yeah, maybe it's time to downsize, Barb. I mean, you're not getting any younger, right?" Barb's chest tightened at the words. They weren't meant to be cruel, she knew that. But they carried an undercurrent that made her feel small, like she no longer had a place in the home she had worked so hard to create. The house that had been her refuge after losing Bill, the house she'd paid off with her own savings, with years of sacrifice. And yet there she was, being told she should be grateful for living here. She took a breath and pushed back from the table, standing to gather herself. She needed to move, needed to think, but something inside her told her this wasn't a passing phase, it was something bigger, a shift she couldn't ignore anymore. Barb's mind wandered back to the long days she had spent turning this house into a home. The weekends she spent sanding the floors, the late nights painting the living room walls, the hours spent in the garden trying to make it bloom in honor of Bill. This house was her legacy, her life, but Kathy's words and actions made it feel as though she didn't belong here anymore. A small, quiet voice inside Barb's head whispered that something wasn't right. Kathy had always been bossy, always demanding, but now it was more insidious, more controlling. Little by little, Kathy had begun making decisions for her, decisions that seemed small but added up to something much larger. What groceries to buy, which doctor she should see, even what time she should go to bed. And David, well-meaning as he was, always seemed to go along with Kathy's suggestions, never questioning her. Barb had tried to dismiss it all at first. Maybe she was imagining things, but no, this was real. She could feel the control slipping through her fingers. As Kathy continued to move around the kitchen, Barb's mind raced. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this go on. Not anymore. Not when Kathy seemed to think she had a right to decide what happened to Barb's life and her home. The thought burned in her chest as she quietly reached for a pen and paper, starting to make notes. She'd never been one to keep a journal, but something told her now was the time. Something wasn't right, and she had to start documenting it before it was too late. Barb sat in her favorite chair, the soft hum of the house surrounding her like an old friend. But today, the air felt thick. Kathy had been more insistent lately, and Barb couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things were shifting, slipping. Slowly but surely, Kathy was taking control. It started with the small things. Kathy insisted on planning Barb's meals, often dismissing her own preferences as outdated or unhealthy. "You really should be eating more vegetables, Mom," Kathy would say, placing a plate of steamed greens in front of her. At first, Barb let it slide. She'd been through worse, after all, it was just food, right? But the control was starting to feel like a weight around her neck. Then there were the doctor appointments. Kathy would schedule them without asking, always suggesting times she thought would be best. "It's just for your own good," Kathy would say, with that tone that made it sound more like a command than a suggestion. David, standing behind her, never seemed to question it. He just nodded as if it were all normal. But it wasn't normal. Barb felt her independence slowly eroding. Kathy was doing things for her that Barb had always done herself. She picked out the groceries, arranged the furniture, even chose the TV shows for the night. It was as if Barb were slowly becoming a guest in her own life, and Kathy was taking over the house they'd once shared. Then one day, Kathy handed Barb a thick stack of papers. "It's just for your peace of mind, Mom," Kathy said, her voice soft and persuasive. "We need to make sure everything is in order in case something happens." Barb glanced down at the papers. It was a power of attorney form. Kathy wanted to be the one making decisions for her if she ever became unable. "I don't need this, Kathy," Barb said, her voice shaking with a mix of confusion and rising anger. "I'm not incapable." Kathy's expression didn't change. "It's just a formality," she said, her tone dismissive, like it wasn't even up for discussion. "Think of it as a safety net for you." David, standing nearby, didn't say a word, but Barb could see the agreement in his eyes. They both expected her to sign it. Barb's heart pounded as she looked at the papers again. The pressure was mounting. Kathy wasn't just managing her health or her meals. She was taking over Barb's decisions, slowly isolating her inch by inch. It was subtle, insidious. "No," Barb said, her voice firm for the first time in weeks. "I don't want this. I'm still capable of making my own choices." Kathy's face darkened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You don't have to decide now, Mom," she said, "but you should. It's for the best." Barb felt a cold wave of realization. This wasn't about taking care of her, it was about control. Kathy had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, and now Barb could feel the walls closing in. Her mind raced. This wasn't just about a piece of paper, it was about her life, her autonomy, and she wasn't going to let Kathy take that from her. The smell of roast chicken filled the house, mingling with the soft clink of silverware on plates. The dining room table was set just the way Kathy liked it, everything in its place, even the napkins folded in neat triangles. Barb watched her daughter fuss over the arrangement, adjusting the utensils one last time before taking her seat. There was a coldness in the air, despite the warmth of the meal. Barb had been quiet, her fork poised over her plate, but her mind was elsewhere. The conversation from earlier in the week, the power of attorney documents, Kathy's insistence on taking control, still gnawed at her. She couldn't let it go, not anymore. It was eating at her, and tonight she would finally ask the question that had been burning in her chest for days. "Why have you been acting like the house isn't mine?" Barb asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and unavoidable. Kathy paused, her fork hovering over her plate as she glanced at Barb, but her expression didn't change. It was as if she had been expecting the question. "It's just the way it is, Mom," Kathy said with a shrug, dismissing the question with a flick of her wrist. "We're helping you." Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, like she had said this 1,000 times before. Barb felt the weight of the words pressing down on her. "How can you help me if you're treating me like I'm a guest?" she challenged, her voice quiet but steady. She didn't want to raise her voice, but the frustration was simmering just below the surface, threatening to spill over. Kathy's eyes flickered with something Barb couldn't quite place, irritation, disbelief, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "You know how it is, Mom, we're just trying to make sure everything's okay, it's for your own good." Barb's pulse quickened as she leaned forward, the weight of her next words pushing against her chest. "I built this house, Kathy. I paid off the mortgage. I turned this place into a home after Bill died. This isn't just some place to live, it's my life." Kathy's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she recovered quickly, shrugging again. "Well, that was a long time ago. Things change," she added with a casualness that stung. "We could always just sell this place and you could move into something smaller. You don't need all this space." The words hit Barb like a slap, leaving her reeling. "Sell it?" she repeated, her voice catching. The thought of it, of giving up everything she had worked for, the house that held every memory, every piece of her life, felt like a betrayal. "This is my home, Kathy. I've spent years here building it, making it my own. It's not just something we can sell off." But Kathy wasn't listening. She pushed a piece of chicken around on her plate, her face unreadable. "I'm just saying, it might be better for you. You could move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to take care of." Barb's breath hitched in her chest. As the realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't about her well-being, it was about control. Kathy didn't see the house as Barb's, she saw it as an obstacle, something that needed to be managed, manipulated, moved aside. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of their silverware on plates. Barb's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her fork, the weight of everything coming to a head. For so long she had stayed silent, letting Kathy take charge. But this was her home, her life, and she wasn't going to let Kathy strip that from her without a fight. "I'm not going anywhere, Kathy," Barb said firmly, her voice low but resolute. "This is my home, I built it, and I'm not giving it up." Kathy didn't respond at first. She just stared at her, a flicker of something crossing her face, a mixture of annoyance and something darker, something calculating. Then, with a soft sigh, she set down her fork and met Barb's eyes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mom. We're just trying to help you." Barb's heart raced, but she held her ground. "I don't need your help, Kathy, not like this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything was still. Neither of them spoke, the weight of their conversation pressing down on the space between them. But Barb knew one thing now: she had to stop waiting for Kathy to change. The fight for her independence, her home, was just beginning, and no matter what Kathy thought, she wasn't going down without a fight. Barb sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers brushing against the small wooden box hidden beneath. She had kept it there for years, out of sight, a silent guardian of her past and her future. It was a simple box, polished and worn, but it held something irreplaceable: the deed to the house. The house? The one she had worked so hard for, the one she had poured her soul into after Bill passed. Barb's fingers trembled as she unlocked the box. She had paid off the mortgage long ago, securing it as her own. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a testament to her independence, her strength. As she carefully pulled the deed out, memories flooded back: the long hours at the library, the late nights managing bills, and the sweat it took to turn this house into a home. No one knew the sacrifices she had made, especially Kathy. She hadn't told her daughter about the deed, not even when Kathy began pushing for control. She tucked the deed back into the box, her heart heavy with the realization that it had come to this. Kathy was trying to take everything from her. Slowly but surely, she was manipulating Barb, pushing her into a corner, making decisions for her under the guise of helping. The power of attorney forms, the constant suggestions to sell the house, all of it was about control. Kathy wasn't concerned about Barb's well-being, she was concerned about the house. Barb knew she couldn't let Kathy have her way, not again, but this time she needed more than just resolve. She needed advice. She needed Michael Rogers, her trusted family attorney. The next morning, Barb picked up the phone and dialed Michael's number. The conversation was short, but it gave her a sense of clarity. "Barb, it sounds like Kathy is trying to take advantage of you," Michael said, his voice steady and professional. "You've been wise to keep the deed hidden, but you need to start documenting everything. Every conversation, every time Kathy pushes you to sign something, the more you have, the better." Barb's stomach twisted. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but Kathy's behavior was becoming clearer. Michael advised her to take action quietly. "Gather evidence, but don't confront her too soon. If you do it right, you'll protect yourself without causing a family rift." Barb took a deep breath, feeling both empowered and anxious. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was time to act. She started writing down every interaction with Kathy, noting her daughter's subtle manipulations and her attempts to control Barb's life. That afternoon, Barb felt a weight lift. The plan had begun. She wouldn't let Kathy take everything from her, not her home, not her life. The fight for her independence had started, and she was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. Barb could feel the walls closing in. It had been weeks since she'd started keeping track of Kathy's actions, each moment of manipulation logged carefully in her notebook. At first, the subtle shifts in behavior had been easy to dismiss: small comments about her health, her eating habits, the endless requests to sign documents. But lately, Kathy had become bolder, more aggressive in her attempts to take control. The once subtle shifts were now open attempts to undermine Barb's authority in her own home. Barb sat at the kitchen table, watching Kathy move around the room, making sure everything was just right, as usual. It was late afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Kathy's chatter filled the space, but it barely registered in Barb's mind. She had learned to tune out the sound of her daughter's voice, the way Kathy spoke, as though she were the one in charge, as though she were the one making all the decisions. Barb's thoughts were interrupted when Kathy suddenly turned to her with a stack of papers in hand. The same papers that had become all too familiar lately. "I think it's time we made sure everything is in order, Mom," Kathy said, her voice sweet but firm. "This is a new will, just to make sure everything's set up for when you're gone. It's nothing complicated, just some changes. You'll be leaving everything to David and me, of course." Barb's breath caught in her throat. A will. Kathy wanted her to sign a new will, one that would leave everything to her and David. Barb's pulse quickened as the realization sank in. This was it, the moment she'd feared had come. Her hands clenched around the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had seen this coming, but hearing it out loud was a different thing entirely. Kathy had been trying to take control for months, but this was the final move. Barb wasn't just a guest in her own home anymore. Now Kathy wanted her to sign away everything she had built. Barb's mind raced back to the day she'd written her own will years ago when Bill was still alive, and when they'd made sure that everything they'd worked for would be passed on according to their wishes. She had hidden that will with the deed tucked away in the safe spot she'd always trusted. She didn't need Kathy's help in making decisions about her own life, her own property. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I'm not signing this, Kathy," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "You don't get to decide what happens to my life." Kathy's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered as if the words had stung but not surprised her. "Mom, I'm just trying to help. It's for your own good. You don't want things to be difficult for David and me, do you? We've been taking care of you." Barb shook her head slowly, the weight of everything that had transpired settling in her chest. "I don't need your help. I'm not going anywhere, Kathy, and I'm certainly not giving you control over what's mine." Kathy paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll change your mind, you always do." But Barb had made her decision. For the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of clarity. She knew she couldn't let this go any longer. Kathy's game was growing bolder and the lines had been crossed. Barb had to act. The next morning, Barb dialed Michael Rogers' number. She needed a full legal consultation. She needed to make sure Kathy couldn't take control of her house, of her life. Michael's voice was steady when he answered, but Barb could hear the concern in it when she explained what had happened. "You were right to call, Barb," Michael said after a brief pause. "This is exactly what I feared. Kathy is trying to gain power over your assets, and she's doing it in a very calculated way. You need to make sure everything is locked down legally and financially." Barb felt a chill run down her spine, but she listened closely as Michael outlined her next steps. She would need to gather every scrap of evidence, every interaction with Kathy, every document Kathy had pushed on her. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. As the call ended, Barb sat back in her chair, the weight of the task ahead of her settling in. She wasn't going to let Kathy take her life from her, not without a fight. The plan had begun, and though she knew the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready. But as she hung up the phone, a dark thought lingered at the back of her mind. Kathy had been manipulative for months, but now it was clear. This wasn't just about control, it was about power, and Barb had no intention of giving that up without a fight. The showdown was coming, and Barb was preparing for it, one quiet step at a time. Barb stood in the kitchen, the room quiet except for the soft sound of Kathy's footsteps as she moved around, pretending to tidy up. The tension between them had been building for weeks, but now it was palpable. Barb's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table, her thoughts racing. She knew what she had to do. Kathy had been pushing her harder lately, trying to make decisions for her, especially when it came to the house. But today was different. Barb was no longer willing to let it slide. "Kathy," Barb said, her voice steady but sharp, "I need you to leave the house alone." Kathy froze, glancing over her shoulder with an expression that blended confusion and irritation. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Barb's breath quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had prepared for this moment. "I'm talking about all these documents you've been pushing me to sign, the power of attorney, the will. It's enough. I've had an AUG." "Age?" Kathy turned fully, her face tightening. "Oh, don't start, Mom. I'm just looking out for you. You're getting older and you need to plan for the future." "I don't need you to plan my future for me," Barb replied, her voice rising slightly. "I've been planning my future for years. I've worked for everything I have, everything." Barb's hand reached for the small envelope she had carefully hidden in the drawer, the envelope containing the deed to the house, the one Kathy didn't know about. She slid it across the table, watching Kathy's eyes flicker with confusion and then suspicion. "What's this?" Kathy asked, her voice tight. Barb leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Kathy's. "This is the deed to the house, my house, not yours, not David's, mine." Kathy blinked, clearly thrown by Barb's calm but firm words. "What are you talking about? You can't just..." I paid off the mortgage years ago, Kathy, Barb interrupted, her voice unwavering. This house is mine. I've worked my whole life to own it, and I'm not giving it up, not for you, not for anyone. For a long moment, Kathy said nothing. Her face shifted from shock to disbelief, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Then finally she laughed, a hollow, nervous sound. You're being dramatic, you don't even remember what you're talking about half the time. Barb's jaw tightened. Don't you dare undermine me, Kathy. I'm still sharp enough to know what's going on. You've been using my age as an excuse to take control of my life. I'm not a burden. I'm not a child. Kathy's face flushed, her eyes narrowing. You're not going to win this, Mom. You'll regret. Barb stood up slowly, not letting her daughter's words shake her. No, you're the one who's been playing games, thinking you can control me. Well, it ends today. The silence between them thickened. Barb's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. Kathy had underestimated her, and now the truth was out. The deed to the house was in her hands, and nothing Kathy could say would change that. Barb wasn't just fighting for her home, she was fighting for her independence, and no one, not even her daughter, would take that from her. Barb sat in the living room, the tension thick in the air. Kathy had been silent ever since their confrontation, sitting stiffly on the couch, arms crossed. Barb's heart pounded, but she wasn't backing down. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The doorbell rang, and Barb rose to answer it. Julia stood there, her expression softening when she saw her mother. Mom, are you okay? Julia asked, stepping inside. I'm fine, Barb said, her voice steady but tired, but we need to talk. Julia looked toward Kathy, sensing the heaviness in the room. Kathy avoided her gaze, and Julia followed Barb to the living room. As they sat down, Barb didn't waste any time. She reached for the deed to the house and slid it across the table toward Julia. Kathy's been trying to take control of my life, Julia. She's been pushing me to sign documents to let her make decisions for me. She's even trying to take the house. Julia blinked, stunned. What, Mom? Why didn't you tell me? Barb sighed, her voice full of quiet frustration. I didn't want to cause problems. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but it's gotten worse. She's been controlling everything, making decisions for me like I can't take care of myself anymore. Julia's expression shifted to one of concern, then disbelief as she looked down at the deed. But you paid off the house years ago, she said, voice trembling with realization. This is yours, not hers. Barb nodded. Yes, I've worked my whole life for it, but Kathy's been pushing me to sign things, making me feel like I'm a burden. She turned her gaze to Kathy, her voice firm, and now she's trying to take it all. Kathy opened her mouth to speak, but Julia cut her off, her voice sharp. Is this true? Have you really been doing this, Kathy? Kathy flushed, her face hardening. You don't understand, Julia. I've been trying to help Mom. She needs me. She's getting older and she doesn't know what's best for her anymore. Julia stood up, her hands trembling in anger. No, what I don't understand is why you've been lying to all of us, trying to take control of everything. Why didn't you just talk to us? David stepped into the room, his face confused. What's going on? Julia turned to him, frustration in her voice. David, you need to hear this. Kathy's been manipulating Mom. She's been pushing her to sign things she didn't want to sign. She's been trying to control everything. David's confusion shifted to concern as he glanced between Barb and Kathy. What, Kathy, is this true? Kathy's eyes widened, and for the first time she hesitated. I was just trying to help. David shook his head slowly, disbelief in his eyes. Help, is that what this has been? Because I didn't see it. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth settling in. Kathy's face twisted with frustration, but she remained silent. Barb looked at Julia and David, her voice resolute. I've had enough. I'm taking control of my life back. The family dynamic had shifted in an instant. The truth was out, and it was clear things would never be the same again. The courthouse lobby was cold, sterile, a far cry from the warmth of her own home, but it felt fitting. This wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about survival, independence, and fighting for the life Barb had worked so hard to build. Barb sat in the waiting area, her fingers tightly gripping the file folder in her lap. Inside it were copies of everything, notes, documents, and the hidden recordings of Kathy's manipulations. She had prepared for this moment as much as anyone could. Beside her, Michael sat quietly, his expression focused. His calm demeanor had been a steadying force through the entire process, but today Barb could feel the weight of what was at stake. "We're ready," Michael said softly, standing as the court officer called their names. Barb stood as well, her legs stiff with nerves. She took a deep breath before following him into the courtroom. The judge was already seated, an air of impatience hanging over the room. Kathy sat at her own table, flanked by her lawyer, looking tense, her eyes narrowed as they locked with Barb's. Kathy hadn't spoken to her since the family confrontation, but Barb could feel the anger radiating from her. She wasn't about to let this go easily. The proceedings began, and Kathy's lawyer stood first, presenting their case. The argument was familiar, a claim that Barb was being manipulated by others, including Michael, into making decisions she couldn't possibly understand for herself. Kathy's lawyer painted Barb as vulnerable, her mind clouded by age and external influence. Barb clenched her jaw but didn't flinch. She'd heard this narrative before from Kathy herself. She knew the game, and she wasn't about to let it work on her. When it was Barb's turn, Michael gestured for her to take the stand. She stood slowly, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She had prepared for this, but it still felt surreal, like stepping into a different world. She felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, the energy of the room suddenly intensifying. She wasn't just defending her property now, she was defending herself. "I've worked for everything I have," Barb began, her voice steady but strong. "This house, my independence, these are my choices. For years, Kathy has tried to take that from me. She's manipulated me, using my age and my memory against me, but I'm still capable. I know what's happening, and I'm here to protect what is rightfully mine." Her words hung in the air, but Kathy's lawyer immediately rose to object, trying to discredit Barb's testimony, claiming she was emotionally compromised. But Barb didn't falter. She had the evidence now, and she would make sure Kathy's game was exposed for what it was. Michael stood beside her, holding up a stack of documents. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation of Kathy's actions, financial manipulations, her insistence on making decisions for Barb, pushing her to sign over control of assets, and even trying to change her will. The evidence speaks for itself." Barb felt a sense of empowerment as Michael laid out the proof, emails, text messages, and the signed documents Kathy had tried to force upon her. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about Kathy's repeated attempts to erase Barb's control over her own life. As the judge listened carefully to both sides, Kathy's composure began to crack. Her once confident stance seemed to shrink as the weight of Barb's evidence mounted. The blood drained from Kathy's face as Michael presented the final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Kathy and Barb where Kathy had openly stated that she would take care of things after Barb's death without Barb's consent. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played, the clarity of Kathy's intentions undeniable. Barb could see the anger rising in Kathy's eyes, but it was clear now her facade was crumbling. The judge leaned forward, clearly weighing the evidence. After a long pause, he turned to the room and addressed Kathy's lawyer. "Given the evidence presented, I am granting Barb temporary control over her assets, including the house, pending further investigation. Kathy, you are prohibited from selling, transferring, or otherwise disposing of any of Barb's property during this time." Kathy's face twisted in disbelief, her lips pressing into a tight line. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the judge's stern gaze silenced her. Barb didn't speak, she simply nodded, a quiet relief washing over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she had a foothold. This wasn't over yet, but it was a victory, a small one perhaps, but enough to prove that she still had control. As Barb and Michael left the courtroom, her pulse slowed, but a new kind of determination settled in. She wasn't done yet. The battle wasn't over. But today, for the first time, she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. The days following the court's decision had been a blur of paperwork and conversations with Michael. Barb was moving forward slowly but surely with a plan to secure her future. There was no time to waste. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was in control of her life, of her house, of the choices that mattered most. She sat at the kitchen table, going over the financial documents Michael had helped her put together. Every figure, every line made her feel a little more solid, a little more confident. She was preparing for the next step, the next layer of protection. The house would be officially secured under her name, not just with temporary control, but with a rock-solid legal foundation. As she reviewed the documents, the doorbell rang. She didn't need to look up, she knew who it was. Kathy. Barb stood, not hesitating, and opened the door. Kathy stood there, her face tight with a mixture of anger and something else, fear perhaps. There was no warmth between them now. Kathy had lost her control and the realization was starting to sink in. "What do you want, Kathy?" Barb asked, her voice steady but with a sharp edge. Kathy opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, glancing at the ground before looking up. "I came to talk," she said, her voice almost pleading. Barb crossed her arms, not letting her guard down. "Talk about what? You tried to take everything from me. I'm not in the mood for more manipulation." Kathy flinched at the words but pressed on. "I'm not here to fight, Barb. I've just been worried about you. This house, it's too much for you now. You can't keep it. You're just—" "No," Barb interrupted, her voice firm. "I've been handling this house for years and I'll continue to. You've crossed a line, Kathy. This is my home and it always has been." Kathy's face twisted with frustration. "You're not thinking clearly. You're old." "I'm not old, Kathy," Barb snapped, taking a step forward. "I'm still capable of making my own decisions. I've worked my entire life for everything I have and I'm not letting you or anyone else take that from me." Kathy's eyes narrowed but her tone shifted. "You don't have to go through all this, Mom. I'm just trying to help. I've been the one looking out for you, doing everything I could to make sure you're okay." Barb shook her head, the weight of Kathy's manipulations still fresh in her mind. "No, you've been trying to control me, push me into things I didn't want, and now I'm taking back what's mine." There was a long silence between them. Kathy's face softened for a moment like she might back down, but the flicker of desperation in her eyes told Barb everything she needed to know. She wasn't going to let go of the power she had over Barb that easily. "You'll regret this," Kathy said quietly, almost a whisper, but Barb could hear the threat in her words. Barb stood tall, her voice unshakable. "No, Kathy, you will regret trying to take everything from me. You've crossed the line and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." Kathy took a step back, her lips tight, and for a moment it looked like she might try one last push. But she didn't. Instead, she turned, walking away without a word, her shoulders hunched in defeat. Barb watched her leave, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced down her daughter's manipulation, and for the first time she felt free of it. But as she turned back to the house, a feeling of both relief and uncertainty washed over her. The battle wasn't over, but she had won this round. Just then, Julia stepped into the room. She had been standing just inside the doorway, listening. "Mom," she said, her voice soft but filled with determination, "we've got this, you've got this." Barb looked at her daughter, a small smile forming on her lips. "Yeah, we do." The two women stood together, a united front, knowing that the fight was far from over. But they had each other, and for the first time in a long while, Barb felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The path ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let Kathy or anyone else take away what she had worked so hard to build. Barb's life was her own, and she was ready to protect it. The days following the court's decision were filled with a new kind of energy for Barb. She had spent so long fighting just to hold onto her independence that now, with the house legally protected and her future more secure than it had been in months, she was focused on rebuilding, on forging ahead with her life. Barb worked closely with Michael to set up long-term plans, making sure that every piece of paperwork was in order, every financial step firmly in place. The house was hers, finally and forever. No one could take that from her. And as she reviewed the documents, her confidence grew. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about everything she had fought for and everything she would continue to fight for. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table organizing her plans, the doorbell rang. Barb's first instinct was to ignore it, but then she saw through the window. It was David. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. When she opened the door, David stood there, looking apologetic but unsure. "Barb, we need to talk," he said quietly. Barb didn't let her emotions show, though inside she was still processing everything that had happened. "What's there left to say, David?" she asked, crossing her arms. He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I know I've made mistakes. I've been blind to what Kathy was doing. I didn't see it until now. I'm sorry." Barb studied his face for a long moment. There was regret there, but she didn't let her guard down. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else manipulate her again. You should have seen it sooner, David. You let her push me into decisions I didn't want to make, Barb said, her voice steady but sharp. But you're not the one who has to live with it, I do. David looked down, his shoulders slumping. I never meant for any of this to happen, I was just trying to help. Barb shook her head. You weren't helping, you were enabling her, you let her control everything and I let it happen, but I won't do it anymore. David looked at her, remorse flooding his features. What can I do now? Nothing, Barb said firmly. I've got this, I'm done needing anyone's approval. The silence between them was heavy, but Barb didn't flinch. She had made her decision. David nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I understand, I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. Barb didn't answer right away. She had already said what she needed to. I've got a community project to start, something for me, it's time to move forward. David turned to leave, but not before he gave her one last look, filled with regret and understanding. Barb stood tall in the doorway as he walked away, her heart finally at peace. She had her life back on her terms, and now with her plans in motion and her rights secured, she was ready for whatever came next. The battle for her independence had been won, and Barb wasn't about to let anyone take it from her again. The air in Barb's house was different now. Lighter, more hers. The walls, once heavy with tension and uncertainty, felt like old friends again, familiar and comforting. Every room she passed seemed to greet her with a quiet pride, as if the house itself had been waiting for her to take control. The weight of Kathy's manipulation had lifted, and Barb finally felt free to breathe in her own space, to reclaim it as her own. Barb spent her days going about her routines with a newfound sense of peace. Mornings started early with coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the familiar trees in the yard. The air was cool, the quiet of the neighborhood enveloping her like a warm blanket. It was a life she had earned, one of calm, of independence, of peace. She had found joy in the small things. Gardening had become a soothing ritual. She planted flowers that reminded her of Bill, their bright petals nodding in the wind like old friends. In the evenings, she spent hours curled up with a book or catching up with friends over the phone. There was no one telling her what to do, no one overstepping her boundaries, just her, the house, and the freedom she had fought for. As the weeks passed, Barb started hosting family gatherings again. The first was small, just Julia and David. She had been hesitant at first, unsure if it would feel right. But when Julia arrived with a basket of fresh fruit and David showed up with dessert, something in Barb's chest lightened. They had learned in their own way how to respect her space, how to be a part of her life without imposing on her. They sat around the dining table, the same table where Kathy had once tried to impose her will, laughing and sharing stories. The air felt different now. For the first time in ages, Barb didn't feel like a bystander in her own home. She was the center of it, in charge of the flow of conversation, of how things moved. It was a strange but beautiful feeling. I'm so glad we're doing this again, Mom, Julia said, her voice warm as she passed Barb a plate. It's been too long. Barb smiled, the weight of her decision still fresh in her mind, but now something else filled the space, contentment. Me too, she said softly, her hand resting on the table. It's good to have you here. David nodded, his tone thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Barb, about taking control of your life. I didn't see it before, but I understand now. Barb met his gaze, her heart steady. It wasn't about just the house, David. It was about my life. I have to own it, everything in it. The conversation drifted, easy and familiar, and for the first time in a long time, Barb felt something akin to peace between them. Kathy's absence was still a ghost in the background, but it no longer held power over her. The house was hers, legally, emotionally, and irrevocably. But there was still work to be done. Barb started planning for her future, creating a well-organized will and trust to ensure that her wishes were followed when the time came. She didn't want to leave anything up to chance. This, too, was part of her reclaiming control. She didn't want to leave the house in anyone else's hands, especially not Kathy's. There were moments, though, when Kathy's absence felt more like an echo than a relief. Barb had learned to block her out, but a part of her still felt the sting of betrayal. Kathy had been her daughter once. The thought of her manipulation, her attempts to control Barb's life, still stung in quiet moments when Barb was alone in her thoughts. But that sting didn't have the power to break her anymore. Kathy's absence was just that, absence. It wasn't fear, it wasn't power. Barb's life now felt like a tapestry woven from threads of her own making. She was making new memories, new connections, building relationships that were based on mutual respect, not manipulation. She reconnected with old friends, spending afternoons at the local park or enjoying coffee at the cafe down the street. Her life had become hers again, completely and fully. One evening, after another family gathering, Barb sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house was quiet now, peaceful, and as she sat there, she reflected on everything she had fought for: the house, her independence, and the strength she had found in herself. The battle hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But for the first time, Barb truly felt like she was in control of her own story. As the night stretched out before her, Barb smiled to herself. Kathy's absence, once feared, had become a space of quiet, and in that silence Barb found her own voice again. Her life was hers, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Barb stood at the front door, watching as Kathy's retreating figure disappeared into the distance. For a moment, a wave of sadness washed over her. Kathy had been her daughter once, but the person standing in front of her had long ago abandoned the family bond, choosing control over love, and Barb had finally had enough. She shut the door with a quiet finality, locking it behind her. There would be no more manipulation, no more guilt trips. She was done being a pawn in Kathy's game. The house felt quieter now, but in the best way possible. The weight of Kathy's presence had hung over it for far too long. Barb breathed deeply, feeling the shift in the air. She had taken control, and that was something she would never let go of again. The next morning, Julia came over with a stack of design magazines and paint samples. "I thought we could work on some new ideas for the house," she said, her voice warm. "Make it feel more like you." Barb smiled, the thought of redesigning her home bringing a sense of excitement. "I'd love that," she replied, eager to take this next step. For the first time, she felt like she was truly creating a space that reflected her, not anyone else's expectations. They spent the afternoon painting walls, moving furniture, and rearranging things to better suit Barb's vision. The house transformed as if it, too, was breathing a sigh of relief. Each new brushstroke felt like reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost for far too long. "You've really done it, Mom," Julia said as they stepped back to admire the room. "You've taken control of your life again." Barb looked around at the fresh, vibrant space. "It wasn't easy, but it feels right," she said, her heart swelling with pride. Days turned into weeks, and Barb's sense of peace deepened. She filled her time with activities she had always wanted to do, taking long walks, joining local groups, reconnecting with old friends. The house was more than just a building now, it was a symbol of her independence. It was hers. Kathy's absence, once a source of constant tension, was now a quiet void. Barb no longer felt its weight, though she could still feel the sting of betrayal in quiet moments. But that was all it was now, a moment, and Barb had learned to move beyond it. When Kathy's calls came, Barb let them ring through to voicemail. She wasn't interested in apologies or excuses anymore. She had drawn her boundaries, and they were firm. One evening, after another family dinner, Barb sat on the porch, her glass of wine in hand, watching the sunset. The peace she had fought for settled over her like a warm blanket. She had finally stepped into her own life, a life that was hers to live on her terms. Barb smiled to herself. She was free, and for the first time in a long while, she was at peace with that. Barb stood on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the soft evening glow casting a peaceful warmth over the house. It had been a long road to this point, but now, as she looked out at the world beyond her front yard, Barb felt a deep sense of contentment she hadn't known in years. The house, her sanctuary, was finally hers, not just legally but emotionally. It was no longer weighed down by manipulation or control. It was hers, completely and wholly. After years of putting others first, Barb had begun to explore a world of possibilities that had once seemed out of reach. She had always dreamed of traveling, but life had always gotten in the way. Now she was making those dreams a reality. Her first trip was a short getaway to a small town she'd always wanted to visit. The sense of freedom she felt, standing on unfamiliar soil with nothing but her own desires to guide her, was invigorating. The trip led to more. Soon Barb was booking flights to cities she had once only read about. Paris was her first international destination, a city that had always been a symbol of independence and adventure. As she walked along the Seine, her heart light, the weight of her past seemed to drift away. She was no longer bound by anyone's expectations. She was living for herself. But Barb didn't stop there. Inspired by her newfound freedom, she launched a small business mentoring women who had faced setbacks, offering them the guidance and encouragement to rebuild their lives. It was a way for her to give back, to help others find the strength she had discovered in herself. Her home, once a battleground, had transformed into a space of peace. The house was now filled with light and laughter, her own laughter. It was no longer just a place to sleep, it was a reflection of her independence. Barb hosted small gatherings with friends, shared meals with neighbors, and took time for hobbies that had once seemed indulgent. Gardening, reading, and taking long walks became simple pleasures, each moment a testament to the life she had reclaimed. Though Kathy's absence still lingered like a distant echo, it no longer carried the weight it once had. Barb had moved beyond the hurt, beyond the control. Kathy's calls went unanswered, her presence no longer something Barb feared. Barb had learned to create her own happiness, independent of anyone else. The woman who had once been ruled by guilt and obligation was now in full control of her life. She had built a new future, one filled with freedom, connection, and joy. As she stood in her now vibrant living room, Barb smiled, knowing that the life she had fought for was not only hers but fully realized. Kathy was gone, but Barb had found something far more valuable than her daughter's approval. She had found her own strength, her own peace. And for the first time, Barb knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Barb stood in the kitchen, the warm scent of dinner filling the air as she set the table. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter, her family's laughter. It wasn't just another meal, it was a celebration of the life she had built for herself. The past was behind her now, and this moment, this evening, was a quiet testament to the strength she had found. Julia and David were already in the living room, preparing the space for the dinner they were about to share. Barb watched them for a moment, feeling the full weight of the change that had come over their relationships. No longer clouded by Kathy's influence, they were free to just be together without judgment or manipulation. The air was lighter, warmer. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. It was the kind of dinner that had once felt impossible back when everything was clouded by tension. But now Barb was surrounded by people who truly saw her not as Kathy's mother or as a victim of circumstance, but as Barb, a woman who had fought for her place in the world and had finally reclaimed it. "You know," Julia said between bites, "I'm really proud of you, Mom, you've come so far." Barb smiled, feeling the warmth of her daughter's words. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You've been by my side through all of it." David nodded, a hint of emotion in his voice. "We both have, Mom, and it's been amazing to see you take control of your life again." Barb felt a pang of pride as she looked at them. Her family, her true family, was here, not bound by guilt or obligation, but by a genuine love and respect that had been built over time. Kathy's absence, once a painful void, no longer cast a shadow over them. It had faded into something that no longer held power. After dinner, as the family lingered around the table, Barb stepped outside to the porch, needing a moment to herself. The evening air was cool, the stars shining bright in the sky. She looked out over the yard, the quiet hum of her home behind her. In that moment, Barb realized how far she had come. She had fought for her home, her independence, and for the ability to live life on her own terms. Kathy's last attempt to return to the family had been met with a cold shoulder, and it had been the final step in Barb's journey toward reclaiming herself. The house, once a battleground, was now a symbol of her strength. It was a sanctuary filled with love, laughter, and peace. Kathy had tried to take it all, but Barb had kept fighting, and now she had everything she needed. Her family was whole again, not through obligation, but through choice. Barb smiled to herself, knowing that this was just the beginning. The final chapter of her life was one she would write on her own terms, and for the first time she felt the freedom to embrace whatever came next. Barb stood in the kitchen, the soft hum of the house around her as she finished preparing the meal. The table was set, the candles flickering gently, and the familiar warmth of her home filled the air. Tonight was different. It wasn't just any family gathering. This one felt final in a way, but it wasn't about endings. It was about new beginnings. The family was coming together again, but this time Kathy was absent. Barb felt no sadness at the thought. In fact, she felt only a quiet peace. Kathy had long since faded from her life. Her attempts to control, to manipulate, had been met with cold indifference, and the finality of that was liberating. Kathy was no longer a part of the picture. Julia and David arrived, as usual, bringing their energy and warmth into the space. There was no awkwardness now, no lingering tension. As they sat down to eat, Barb looked at them both, at her son, her daughter, and felt a sense of pride and gratitude. They had weathered storms together and apart, and now they sat across from her as equals, no longer bound by the past, no longer tethered to the strings that Kathy had tried to pull. You know, Mom, Julia began, lifting her glass in the air, this dinner feels different. It's like we've finally found our way back to each other, and it's all because of you. David joined in, his voice sincere. We're proud of you, Mom. I don't think I've ever seen you more yourself, more free. Barb looked at her children, her heart swelling. She smiled and raised her glass to them, her voice steady. I couldn't have done it without you. We've all come through a lot, but we're stronger for it. The laughter and warmth of the evening enveloped them, but Barb couldn't help but reflect on everything she had endured, everything she had fought for. It had been a battle for control, for peace, and for the life she deserved. She had fought hard to get here, but now, with her family united and her business flourishing, it all felt like a reward. No more manipulation, no more living in the shadows of others. Her business had grown beyond her expectations. Mentoring women who had lost their way, showing them how to reclaim their lives, had given Barb a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. She was building a legacy not just for herself, but for others who needed the strength and guidance she could offer. Every day, Barb was reminded that her own fight had led to something greater, something that would ripple outward far beyond her own experience. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Barb felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her life was her own. Kathy's absence didn't sting anymore. She had moved on, she had to, and as Barb sat surrounded by those who truly cared for her, she realized that she was finally free. After the meal, as they all lingered in the living room, Barb felt a profound sense of peace. Her life was in balance now. Kathy's attempts to re-enter had failed, and her absence was no longer a wound. It was simply a chapter closed. Barb took a deep breath, looking at her children, at the life she had worked for. You thought you could control me, she whispered to herself, a sense of finality settling in her chest. But I've always been in charge. For the first time, Barb felt the weight of the past fall away entirely. She was no longer held back. She was finally living the life she had always wanted, the life she had fought for, and it was hers completely. As the night stretched on, Barb's smile deepened, knowing that no one could take her peace, her strength, or her future from her. It had taken time, it had taken resilience, but now she was free, and that was everything.